Hi, my name's Josh. I'm the events coordinator here at Lone Pine State Park in Kalispell, Montana. We've been producing a Tidbit Tuesday video about once a week since early April. These videos have been a passion project of mine, but with summer ramping up and more events and programs on the way, we're going to have to put a pause on weekly uploads. We're most likely going to resume in September or October. We started this video series with a video on tree identification, so I figured I'd leave it off with one final video on the subject. Today, we're going to learn how to identify 5 edible plants you can find here at Lone Pine. Let's get started. So right here, we have Western Larch. Now most people don't picture Western Larch as being an edible tree, but there is actually something in this tree that you can eat, and that's its sap. Native Americans would tap this tree for its sap, similar to how we'd tap a maple tree. They do that sort of in mid to late spring, and then they'd boil the sap so it would thicken and become very sweet. So you can see these trees all throughout northwestern Montana, and there's a couple good ways to identify them. First off, the bark. Now the bark is very red and flaky, so it just kind of comes right off if you touch the tree. Now the bark is fairly similar to Ponderosa Pine, so it's not a great identifier, but a better way to identify it is by the branches. Now the branches are covered in small nodules, which I'll just show you right here. And you can see these nodules just lining the branches. Now the reason this branch has these nodules is because the Western Larch loses its needles every fall and regrows them in the spring. So the needles will come out of these nodules here. And the Western Larch will drop its branches as it gets older, so typically all on the ground around it you'll see a lot of these branches. A final way to identify it is by the cones. Now you can find the cones around the base of the tree. Usually over here. Here's a Western Larch cone right here. It's fairly small. You can see it's about the size of the tip of my thumb. It's kind of squat, and it has these little mouse tails coming out from under each scale. So that's pretty much the best way to identify Western Larch. You look at the bark, you look at the branches, which are going to be on the ground, and look at the cones. And if you're lucky, sometime in early spring, you can tap this tree and make some delicious syrup out of it. So right here we have chokecherry. Now chokecherry is definitely one of the more iconic edible plants that we have here at Lone Pine. Now chokecherry is going to produce its berries sort of in the next couple of weeks, and they're going to be ripe in late summer through early fall. So you can identify chokecherry from a distance actually, because it produces these seed pods that the berries are going to come out of. So it's sort of maybe about 3 to 4 inches long, hanging off the branch, and you can see right here maybe, let's see, you can see one cherry already getting ready to come in. So like I said, these cherries are going to be ripe in late summer to early fall, and when you pick them they're pretty good. You can make them into jams, pies, and preserves. Just make sure you pick them when you're ripe, because they actually get the name chokecherry because when you pick them when they're unripe they're very bitter, makes you almost feel like you're choking. So looking for these is a great way to identify chokecherry. You can also look at the leaves, which are fairly glossy and smooth with sort of rippled edges. And they're not too big, they're maybe about 3 inches long. And the tree itself is going to get maybe 30 feet at its maximum with nice, smooth gray bark. So yeah, that's pretty much it for identifying chokecherry. So here we have Serviceberry, also known as Saskatoon. Now Serviceberry is pretty common throughout Lone Pine and pretty famous around northwestern Montana because you'll see a lot of Serviceberry jams, wines, preserves, things like that. And that's because Serviceberry produces a delicious small black berry in the next couple of weeks actually, so sort of late June, early July, it's going to start producing these berries. You can see them on the plant right now actually. Now at this point the berries aren't ripe yet, but you can still see them on the plant as these little green balls. They're pretty small, less than half an inch, but you'll see them hanging off the plant as you walk by. Another good way to identify them is by the leaves. The leaves are very small, about 1.5 to 2 inches long at their biggest. Here's a bigger leaf. They're fairly rounded, and they also are serrated, which means they have these little teeth that go around the plant. Another good way to identify it is by the bark, which is this sort of reddish rust color on the newer bark, and more gray as it gets older. Serviceberry is similar in size to chokecherry. It's going to get maybe 20 to 30 feet at its maximum, but it grows more out than it does up. You can see this one is kind of more in the shape of a bush. It's circular, whereas the chokecherry was a straight up tree. And that's pretty much the best way to identify this. So you're gonna see these berries coming out pretty soon. Knowing how to identify Ponderosa pine is an excellent thing if you ever get lost in the woods. Because Ponderosa pine has something that many pine trees have, and that is vitamin C in the needles. Now, if you ever get lost in the woods and you're hunting for food, there's always the risk of getting scurvy because you're not consuming enough vitamin C. So Ponderosa pines are an excellent source of vitamin C. Here. So a good way to identify Ponderosa pine is by the needles. Now the needles are going to come in groups of 3, and each needle is going to be about 5 to 7 inches long. So you'll see them like this. One thing to note is that on the east of the divide, Ponderosa pine needles are 2 to a bunch instead of 3. A little weird, no one's quite sure why that is, but just something to be aware of. So the bark of Ponderosa pine is very red. It's also pretty flaky, like that of the western larch, and it's deeply grooved. You can see all these deep grooves in the bark. The bark of older ponderosas are going to be reddish on the outside with sort of deep gray grooves on the inside. However, younger ponderosas are going to be gray on the outside with reddish grooves on the inside. You can see that this young ponderosa has mostly gray bark on the outside with little patches of red on the inside. So just keep that in mind when you're looking to identify Ponderosa pine if you want to use it as a potential food source, either for survival or if you want to make pine needle tea, which is also quite delicious. The last plant we're going to look at today is creeping Oregon grape. Now we have some creeping Oregon grape right here, growing up beside the visitor center, but it's really common throughout the understory of the park. You can usually spot creeping Oregon grape really easily during the winter because it's one of the few plants that stays green during the winter, but during the summer you'll see it just kind of matting the ground with these maybe 2 to 3 inch long leaves. They'll have small serrated edges on them, and the biggest feature you're going to see on creeping Oregon grape is the actual grapes that it's going to produce. So these grapes, they're not quite ready yet. They're not going to be ready until late summer, but it's going to produce large berries. They're not actually grapes, they're just called grapes because they kind of look like grapes. And the grapes are horribly bitter, but they are edible, and people will take them and turn them into usually jams and preserves by adding a lot of sugar to them. And creeping Oregon grape, it's going to have a lovely yellow flower in the spring, and these flowers have already been pollinated, so you can see they're turning into berries. So you'll see a lot of this plant throughout the park as it kind of hugs the ground, and especially keep an eye out for this during the winter. But always make sure if you're going to take the berries off the plant, don't eat them raw because they're very bitter and taste horrible. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. I've been having a lot of fun making these videos for you guys, and it's a bit of a bummer to stop right now, but we're going to pick them up later. So I hope you stay tuned for future videos that we make, and make sure to always look on our YouTube and our Facebook page because we'll be producing other content there, just not Tidbit Tuesdays for the next couple of weeks. I hope you found this video helpful. As always, if you have any questions, leave them down in the comment section below. Thank you for watching.